invite you to open up your Bibles to Luke chapter 24. We'll stay there for just a moment. I will just give us a brief moment here to pause from that lengthy reading there. Both this morning, really throughout the week, before every lesson, is not going to be that lengthy. It's just very specific verses that I think kind of encapsulate the purpose of each lesson that we're going to be going through. I will just say, if you weren't here this morning, again, one, yes, this is a bow tie, and bow ties are cool. Two, you will notice that I have a hoarse voice. I've tried everything I can for the past week or so. I don't know why it is this way. Actually, I think I have an indication. It's just seasonal allergies. It's caused my voice to go hoarse. And so there's not much I can do about that. But Paige made a comment earlier to one of y'all. Before we left after the worship service, she said, it is almost grating every now and then to hear his voice like that. It is not painful to me. It may be painful to you, but I'm going to do the best I can to take sips of water and eat cough drops to make sure that it doesn't get worse as the night goes through. But I will just say, all of that just to say, I really do hope that that's not too much of a hindrance as we are studying God's Word tonight. Just a couple of things again. I really appreciate you all inviting me and my beautiful wife, Paige, to be with you this week and to share a topic that I am excited about. I'm always excited to talk about Jesus, obviously, but especially when you see the treasure trove within the Old Testament that I think so often it is like an abundant well of water that is untapped, I think. And so I'm excited to share with you some of the things that I have found in my own studies as we go through some of these things. If you were not here this morning, we talked about how I think there is a case to be made for more Old Testament preaching because it is all leading to Christ. It's all preaching about Jesus. The Bible is one story. And at the centerpiece of that story is Jesus on the cross and how he beats death. And that is how we have victory. That is how we come into a relationship with God. That's fundamental. That is the purpose of why we do what we do. And so I don't want to do away, I don't want to forget the value of the things that are in the Old Testament. Since Jesus is what binds it all together. Tonight, what we're going to look at are, what I hope are helpful keys that will aid us in our study to find Jesus and to find just valuable notes about the Old Testament all throughout the Bible. This is the title of our series, Glimpses of Jesus, and incidentally, it's the title of our lesson tonight. And I really do appreciate the hymns that were selected. I think that those were just spot on. I really do appreciate those, especially in that first hymn that we sung. You notice in one of those lines there, it talks about bread of heaven, lead me till I want no more. Let me tell you. I mean, those are one of the more explicit examples that you find from the Old Testament where Jesus says, I am the bread of life. I'm the manna from heaven. And it really does just hit the spot when you know the context behind that. And you go back to Exodus chapter 16 and you see just how vital that manna was for their survival. And what a boon it was in their relationship to God, or at least what it should have been in their relationship to God. Well, let's actually get into I want to try and stick with the outline as much as I can. 3 points that we're going to look at tonight. And this first point is really just going to be more brief. It's somewhat of just a little bit of a review. We already looked at Matthew chapter 5 in verses 17 through 18, where Jesus says, I did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And what that means is it's not just to be forgotten. It's not to be considered as not valuable, but rather it is supposed to be considered as that which leads us to Jesus. As you see in Galatians chapter 3 and Romans chapter 10 and verses 1 through 4, all of this was designed to get us to him. And that is why it's valuable in and of itself. And I would just add to that, as you look back at Luke chapter 24, the verse we already read, and the verses we read this morning incidentally, both in verse 27 and verse 44, each time as he's talking to the two men on the road to Emmaus, or whether it be the disciples in verse 47, or verse 44 rather. In each case, he brings in the law, the prophets, the Psalms. And why does he do that? To say, I'm going to talk to you about me. And I want to be able to see Jesus on every page. I would say if you're not seeing Jesus, for one thing, I think we have to learn what to look for to see him. But if you're not seeing Jesus at all in the Old Testament, I would just say realize that the first century Jews didn't either. They did not recognize him. And Paul says they ought to have. All throughout Romans, I think that's what he's saying. You should have recognized him. And incidentally, we're going to come back to that thought in Galatians on Wednesday when we look at what it means to be sons of Abraham, and we'll look more at that. But just to understand, but that's how the first century Jews looked at Jesus as well. He was an unfamiliar face. He was a stranger to them, and what that represented was the fact that the law, God's word, had always been foreign to them. It wasn't a friendly face. And so we don't want to be in that same boat. We don't want to look at the law like the Pharisees did. It is the very character of God. So when we look at it, we should think the same thing as David. Whatever the case, in whatever portion of the Scriptures, whatever portion of the Old Testament, I want to speak like David. How love I thy law. And your law is right. It is pure. It is perfect. It enlightens the eyes. It brings strength to me. I want to speak about it, all of God's word, in the same way David does. Well, that's a more review. But more than that, there are both subtle and I would say outright direct examples all throughout the Old Testament. It's harder to find the subtle ones, but I do think that they are still there, though they may not be as clear or as outright as some of the things we'll talk about. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, we read that this morning. We're going to look at it in a little bit more detail tonight. But one of the few things that he says, but that the rock that was struck to bring water to Israel, that was Christ. And we already talked about the manna from heaven. In John chapter 6, Jesus says, I am that manna. And he says the same thing in 1 Corinthians 10. And all of this history that he gives, he says, it was done to give an example for you. Not the Jews under the old covenant, but for Christians. These are examples for us to take, to learn from, and therefore to make proper application in our lives under the new covenant. And so there are very direct depictions of Christ throughout the Old Testament that I think are made very clear as you get to the New Testament, like 1 Corinthians 10, Hebrews chapter 7, which is incidentally another example we're going to look at in more detail tonight. As he talks about Melchizedek, he makes a direct correlation between Jesus being priest most high and Melchizedek being a priest of God. But it's easy to find those shadows. It's easy to find the types when they just give it to you. What I want to be able to do is just use these explicit images of Christ to help us in our study with the more subtle depictions, because the subtle depictions, they do abound. But I would just say, to balance this out, we need to make sure that we're making tight connections. What I mean by that is we're not stretching to say, well, this is Jesus, this is, we want to make sure that these are strong, firm connections. We don't want to add to the word. But on the other hand, to balance that out, we don't want to take anything away from it and ignore the beautiful messages that we find all throughout. And so I want to find that balance. I will just say, when looking at this notion, there was a story I came across the other day, and I thought it was beautiful, and I wanted to share it with you because I think that it kind of speaks to this notion. It was about an actor and an old preacher. And it goes something like this. It's an old story because at the very beginning it says there was an actor at a drawing room function, so you know that's an old story. He was asked to make a recital. So he stood up, and wanting to be gracious to his audience, he says, I'll recite anything you like for me to recite. He looked for volunteers, but no one suggested anything. But there was an old preacher sitting near the back, and he said, I would like to hear you recite the 23rd Psalm. Well, the actor was a little shocked at that. Wasn't what he was expecting. But he had made the offer, so he decided he would live up to it. He did know the 23rd Psalm, so he repeated it with complete eloquence, masterfully interpreted, diction was beautiful, and when he was done, there was spontaneous applause throughout the entire room. The actor, figuring he'd get back at the old gentleman said, Now, sir, I'd like to hear you recite it. The old gentleman did not bargain for that, but because of his love for Christ, he stood up and repeated the 23rd Psalm. His voice cracked, much like mine throughout the day. It broke, It wasn't very beautiful. Interpretation really wasn't all that good. And when he got done there in reciting the 23rd Psalm, there was no applause, but there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The actor, sensing his own effect, stood up and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I reached your eyes and ears, but he reached your hearts." And the difference is, I knew the psalm, but he knew the shepherd. The difference there is what I want to focus on. I don't want to be like the Pharisees. I don't want to be like the Jews in the first century who just didn't know the shepherd and didn't care to. They knew the law. They knew the words, and they could speak them fluently. But did they really, truly know? Did they apply them? Did they hold them fast in their hearts like David? I'd say the vast majority, absolutely not. And so I want to be like that old preacher. I want to be able not only to recite the words, but I want to recite them in such a way that implies I know the one who gave me these words. So I thought that was a beautiful story. I wanted to share it with you. I want to have that kind of relationship with the very words of God. And so that brings us to the next point. We need to be able to see Jesus as we go all throughout the Bible story, from Old Testament to New Testament. But as we talk about things like shadows and types, I think it's a good idea to just give a definition to those things, try to understand them a little bit more, so that way we can find these things more often. And you might just turn to Hebrews chapter 10. We'll be reading from there in just a moment. Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews chapter 10. First of all, I just want to talk about the notion of shadows. Shadows are always cast by the substance. When you look down at the sidewalk on a sunny day and you see your shadow, it is not the shadow is casting you. It is not the shadow is the substance. That's the real thing. No, you are that body, and it is your body that is casting the shadow. Now, in looking at this when it comes to Christ, in Hebrews chapter 10, in verse 1, more details given about the law than what we looked at this morning. It says, "For the law, since it is only a shadow of the good things to come, and not the very form of things, can never by the same sacrifices which they offer continually year by year make perfect those who draw near. Otherwise would they not have ceased to be offered? Because the worshippers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have had consciousness of sins. But in those sacrifices there is a reminder of sins year by year, for it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins." Now, again, we talked about how the law, it was just a shadow. It was a foretaste of the beautiful things, the blessings that we would have in Christ. The end goal was always Christ. And that's what makes the law so beautiful, because it's pointing just to his face. It's pointing to his character. Now, as it talks about, it mentions several things here in Hebrews chapter 10, and you might just put a bookmark here because we'll be looking at a few different verses here. But you just thinking about the offerings that were given as a shadow, everyone understood it was not the blood of bulls and goats that was going to be able to take away this. Well, at least the faithful. I really do believe that there was a good portion of Israel, the ones that were not genuine like David or Simeon or Anna in Luke chapter 2, the portion that was not faithful Israel. I do think they kind of looked at the law in a transactional way. It's kind of like, I heard this recently, and I like the way he put it. There was a preacher who said, it's kind of like the way we look at the speed limit. Okay, it says 40. I think I'm willing to pay the fee to go 55. I think that's how the Jews looked at the law. It wasn't something that was going to transform them. It wasn't something that they were going to try and make deep application in their lives. It was just something, well, essentially, I know that I know what I really want to do. I think especially about the Sabbaths in this, when is the Sabbath going to be over? So that way we can get back to these evil deeds. When is the Sabbath going to be, it's okay for us to do the evil deeds because I'm just not doing it on the Sabbath, right? Well, the Sabbath means nothing to you if that's how you're going to treat it. If you're not thinking about the rest of the week, the rest of your life, it doesn't matter what you do on the Sabbath. And I think that's how they tended to look at not just the Sabbath, but all of God's law, all of God's commandments. And yes, we can do the same thing today. When it comes to all of the commandments that God has given us under the new covenant, I think we can look at it in similar ways. I don't want to rehash some of the things we talked about this morning, but we definitely can. Colossians 2, just hammering in this notion, Colossians 2 and verse 16. It says, therefore, no one is to act as your judge in regard to food or drink or in respect to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath day, things which are a mere shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Anytime you look in the Old Testament and we think about shadows, types, the copies of things and the reality of things, Jesus is never the shadow. He is always the substance. He is the substance of all of the things that we see. I remember Tommy Peeler, who actually is preaching at Avon Heights now. I don't know when this was, but there was someone who was in a class of his, and there was a fellow who came up to him and just asked Brother Peeler, he said, "What can you give me a comprehensive list, basically a compilation of verses from the Old Testament that have to do with Jesus?" And Brother Peeler just simply looked at him and he said, if there is one verse that is not, if there's one verse lacking from the Old Testament, then it is not a complete list. And I like what he had to say there. And I really do think that that notion is true, that it all points to Christ. And everything is fulfilled in Christ. And we don't want to look at these things in the Old Testament and get confused when we are trying to look for these things, thinking that he is the shadow that's being cast. No, he is the one casting the shadow. He is the perfect, the pure, the brightest original. I'm getting ahead of myself. But he is the thing that is actually casting the shadow. And therefore, everything that you find that is good within the law, what it means, it's going to be better when you get to the substance. With the Sabbath, there are many good things about the Sabbath, many blessings. And you get to the Sabbath year, you get to the year of Jubilee, the year of Atonement. You had a whole year of Sabbath, and it was important to keep those. Every good thing, every blessing that you find there, it's met in Jesus. And I just think, maybe not exactly in material terms, but especially when it comes to the spiritual, everything is met there. Well, going beyond that, not only thinking about shadows, but when you think about types and originals, types always reflect the original. What do I mean by that? Well, in Romans chapter 5, let's see how this language is used. In Romans chapter 5, beginning in verse 12, it says, therefore, just as through one man sin entered into the world, speaking of Adam, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men, because all sinned. For until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed when there is no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam until Moses, even over those who had not sinned in the likeness of the offense of Adam, who is a type of him who was to come. When it's speaking of Adam as a type of him who was to come, is it a positive? Is it a positive correlation? Not necessarily. When it's speaking of Adam, how is he a type of Christ? Well, through one man, something came into the world. Through Adam, it was death. Now, we don't attribute that to Christ, and rightfully so. And so one of the things we want to take from this is that it's not necessarily a positive connection. Not everything is 100% identical. And you see that as you continue on in the text. In Romans 5 and verse 15, it says, but the free gift is not like the transgression. For if by the transgression of the one the many died, much more did the grace of God and the gift by the grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, abound to the many. So then, as through one transgression there resulted condemnation to all men, even so through one act of righteousness there resulted justification of life to all men. In verse 19, for as through the one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, even so through the obedience of the one, the many will be made righteous. And so, where is the comparison? Well, again, the comparison is in the fact that one man brought something into the world, but the results are completely opposite. And so not everything is 100% identical, yet there are strong similarities. Adam was a type of Christ. Christ clearly is a better, when you think about him being the substance of that shadow, oh goodness, aren't we so glad we got to the substance? Because the shadow was pretty dim. And so when you get to that substance, it makes it all the more beautiful. It becomes a positive lesson, I'd say. You go beyond that, not just in the example of Adam. When you think about the word Messiah or Christ, Christ is the Greek translation of Messiah. Do you know what that means? It means the Lord's anointed. That's what that means. And what is the Lord's anointed? But it is a king. All throughout the Old Testament, all throughout the kingdom, the united kingdom and the divided kingdom of Israel and Judah, what you find are many shadows and types of the Lord's anointed. You even see it with Saul. And I want to look at a specific verse here. There are a few passages we could go to. There's clearly a correlation in the fact that he is a king, but when you think about Saul, Saul ain't a good king. He is rather a fool, and he makes several bad decisions, and he leads the nation into just poorly made decisions. He leads them against David, and so he's clearly not a great king. As Saul is trying to, kill David, David has fled from his home. He's fled from Israel, even though he is, as he has already been told that he will be the king of Israel. He flees from Saul. He never fights against Saul. That's what's so interesting, is that even though Saul is his hatred is palpable towards David, David won't lift a finger against him. And there's 2 times that he would be able to kill Saul, and he doesn't. And I like what he says. In 1 Samuel chapter 26, in verse 8, Abishai said to David, "Today God has delivered your enemy into your hand. Now therefore, please let me strike him with the spear to the ground with 1 stroke, and I will not strike him the second time." Now, again, a couple of things. One, Abishai is saying, I'm not going to make him suffer. He'll be dead. He's asleep. All it's going to take is 1 strike. And so it's not like he's going to suffer. Beyond that, is Saul not David's enemy? No matter what David says about Saul, Saul has made himself an enemy of David. And so that there's truth there. But what does David say to Abishai? Do not destroy him, for who can stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be without guilt? That's the same word that's used by Daniel when he talks about that Messiah, the Prince, capital P, as it references the coming Prince of Peace. And so it's the exact same word. Now again, how do we look at Saul and think that he could possibly be a shadow or a type of Jesus? Well, again, you definitely have the fact that he is a king. Clearly, none of the faults of Saul can be attributed to Jesus. Clearly, none of the negative things we want to attribute to the kind of king Jesus would be. Could he be a shadow in the fact that, listen, here is a bad example of a king. And everything that Saul is, my king, the one that I am sending to you, he will not be. Especially when you look at the comparisons made or the contrasts made between David and Saul. I think what you essentially have in that story is, all right, you guys want a king, go ahead and have your pick. And they choose someone who looks great. They choose somebody that on the outside externally looks amazing, and they say, that's the guy I want. He's a fool. He's a bad king. He was not a man after God's own heart. And after that failure, what does God do? But he says, all right, now I'm going to pick a king. And he picks David. And even Samuel seems, at the beginning, when he goes to all of his siblings, he's like, surely this guy, all of his older brothers, this guy has to be the man that God is talking. Hey, I don't look at people the same way you guys do. And what does he pick? He picks, the ruddy little man, David. That's the man that he picks. But it's because he was a man after God's own heart. And so I think even there what you find is Saul, that's not what the coming king is going to look like. David, that's a lot closer. And when you think about how the people talked about David, even in the first century, it was all positive. We want another man like that. Now, to a degree, some of it was for bad reasons, because they say, I want a man like that who has blood on his hands and is going to slaughter the Romans. But there, God's saying, that's not the part of the shadow that I'm talking about. What I'm saying is this truly is a man after my own heart. This is a man who has my heart. And so, but also, not only that, but even within what David says about Saul, Who could stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be without guilt? Even when Saul is killed, not by David or his men, but by a foreigner. He kills that man and says essentially the same thing. Was it such a light thing for you? If that is true about a man like Saul, how much worse for the hands that were willfully and hatefully put against Jesus, the true Lord's anointed. It's emphasized when you get to the cross. How much worse, how much more guilty are those people? So I think that there's some helpful notes there as we look at how to look for those types in our own Bible study. Going beyond that, as you look at the copies, that's another word that we sometimes see. Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 23. Look at what it says here. Hebrews chapter 9, beginning in verse 23. It says, as it's just been talking about the tabernacle and how the blood of the offerings had to be sprinkled around the tabernacle and sloshed onto the tabernacle, onto the altar rather. Verse 23. After speaking about all those things, it says, therefore it was necessary for the copies of the things in the heavens to be cleansed with these, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. Before we move on, was the tabernacle a trivial thing? The whole end of Exodus, and then you get into Leviticus, it talks about not only how to build the tabernacle, that was a feat in and of itself, but then when you talk about how to approach God within the tabernacle, that was not a trivial thing. In fact, you looked at Leviticus chapter 10 with Nadab and Abihu. They come before God, and as they get to the holy place, and they're destroyed because of the way that they treat God as unholy and profane. So it's not a trivial thing. In verse 24, for Christ did not enter a holy place made with hands, a mere copy of the true one, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Nor was it that he would offer himself often as the high priest enters the holy place, year by year with blood that is not his own. All of those things were beautiful. They were meant to show us a picture of what was to come. And even though they were such weighty responsibilities to be a priest and come before God in that manner, what you see here is an even higher honor and a more glorious reality. And as you see on the screen, what you find is that it is the tangible things we can see and touch, which are the copies, and the intangible, the eternal things that are the reality. We switch that all the time. We always tend to think, and I understand why, because of our senses. We can see, if we can see it, it's real. If we can touch it, it's real. That's reality. But what the scriptures teach is, listen, there isn't even, how do I say this, a realer reality than the one that you exist in. The heavenly places, heaven, and the spiritual bodies, really, when you think about it in the long run, they are more real than here, because this is not going to last. Even if we die before the Lord comes, at some point, all of this is going to burn up and turn to ash. And where are we going to go? Into eternity. That's reality. And we need to think in those terms. I think you see this especially when it comes to the application of that in our prayers. How often do we think we get into a problem and we're really stressed out? We think, okay, what can I do? You ask somebody, you ask a brother or sister in Christ, and you say, have you prayed? And they're just like, okay. All right, I prayed. Now, what can I really do? How many times have people said that? I think we show that we switch the fact that the spiritual is more important than the physical. Not to say that we don't do everything we can on earth, but are we putting the earthly things as more important than the spiritual? That's what the Jews did with with the law and everything that was talked about in the law, instead of seeing the reality of which it was pointing to in Hebrews chapter 8. With all that being said, then does this mean that these shadows were or are unnecessary? Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 3 beginning, it says, for every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices. So it is necessary that the high priest also having something to offer. Now, if he were on earth, He would not be a priest at all, since there are those who offer the gifts according to the law, who serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things, just as Moses was warned by God when he was about to erect the tabernacle. For see, he says, that you make all things according to the pattern which was shown you on the mountain. But now he has obtained a more excellent ministry, by as much as he is also the mediator of a better covenant, which has been enacted on better promises. Were those things unnecessary? No, that was that tutor. That was that guide rail that actually gets us to the culmination of all of these promises that God has been making. They were important because we needed that to get to Christ in the first place. And without that, you don't get there. And in Galatians chapter 4, what does God say? But at the fullness of the times, God sent forth his Son. So, hopefully, as we talked about some of those things, that will make things a little bit easier as we think about how to find those shadows and types. Now, what I want to do with the remainder of our time, just for a few moments, is look at really just a couple of very explicit, and I would say descriptive images of Christ to help us see how we put these principles into action. Well, first of all, as you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, again, we'll go ahead and read in verse 1. It says, "For I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea." I will just say as a side point, all these things we're talking about, it is interesting that it uses the word baptized here. We don't have time to talk about that, but that may be something to come back to in the future. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. All right, now let's think about this for just a moment. What is he talking about? What is the context of this language, that the rock was Christ? Well, I think it's referring to specifically two incidents in the Old Testament. And one of those incidents you find in Exodus chapter 17 and another in Numbers chapter 20. Exodus chapter 17, very soon after they have been delivered from Egypt, after the Exodus, they are being led through the wilderness by God and being provided for by God. And one of the ways he provides for them is bringing water from the rock. Quite literally, water of life. It's how they survived as they were wandering through the wilderness. Now, you go beyond that. Interestingly, in each case, there was some level of grumbling, complaining, rebellion to a degree. We'll come back to that in a moment. But in Numbers chapter 20, it's a little bit different. Because in Exodus 17, what God told Moses was to speak to the rock. He did. Numbers 20, this time, he doesn't tell him to speak to the rock, or to strike the rock, rather. I got that confused. This time in Numbers chapter 20, he says, now you speak to it. We look at Numbers chapter 20, and sometimes we can understand why Moses would think, well, I think I'm going to go ahead and strike it. Because that's what he did originally. But what matters, obviously, is what God had told him to do. He did disobey God in striking the rock instead of speaking to it. Now again, is there anything to take from these stories, in the differences between the stories? Well, in one case, what you have is that a rock was struck to bring forth waters of salvation, or waters of life. Does that sound familiar? In the story of Christ and the cross? You do have a stone of stumbling. And you see, even in Isaiah chapter 8 and verse 14, we don't have enough time to go there, but in Isaiah 8 and verse 14, it talks about that notion again, that there will be a rock, a stone of stumbling for Israel. And it is that rock that Israel themselves strike. Now, even though it struck in rebellion, in the cross, it still brings forth waters of life. In Numbers chapter 20, Moses was supposed to speak. He didn't. He decided to strike, whether it be out of anger or whatever the case was. Ultimately, it was unbelief, God says. Whatever the case, even though he struck it in rebellion, the waters come. Now, that does not speak to, do we want to be more like Moses in that matter? No. This is a lesson of how gracious and merciful God is. And how gracious and merciful God is when the rock, Christ, was struck on the cross. And through that, that's what brings forth the waters of life. But you go even a step further. The rock has been struck, but now you don't keep striking the rock. In that second story, the rock had already been struck. In Numbers chapter 20, now it's time to speak to that rock. You don't have to keep coming to it in rebellion to get that water. That's done. Now you have free access. And what does it say when you take this over into the realm of Jesus? You don't keep striking. You don't keep sacrificing him over and over again. But now we have an advocate in heaven. 1 John chapter 2 and verse 1. Now we have an advocate that we can come to, who sits at the right seat at the hand of God, or at the seat at the right hand of God. And so there's just a couple of things there. I kind of want to go through these somewhat briefly, but there's a few things there that I think they're subtle, but I do think that there's strong connections, tight connections that you can make when you look at Jesus and how he was that rock which brought forth the waters of life. Well, going over to Genesis chapter 14, we'll come to Hebrews 7 in just a moment, but Genesis 14, we meet a man named Melchizedek. And we meet this man for one moment in the Bible story, really at the very beginning of the story, and then you never see him again. Genesis 14, when Lot had been taken captive, Abraham sent men and liberated Lot, and they destroyed the men. Abraham was successful. It says, after his return, in verse 17, from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Sheba, that is, the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High. He blessed him and said, Blessed be Abraham of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. He gave him a tenth of all. Now, you see a little bit more of the discussion there between specifically the king of Sodom and Abraham. That's not the portion that really matters while we're talking about the quotation in Hebrews. What's interesting is that you see this man for 3 verses, and from just 3 verses, the Hebrew writer will use this story to make several points about Jesus' priesthood, to make several doctrinal points about Jesus' priesthood. Hebrews 7 and verse 1, it says, For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham as he was returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him, to whom also Abraham apportioned a tenth part of all the spoils, was first of all, by the translation of his name, king of righteousness, and then also king of Salem, which is king of peace. Without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, he remains a priest perpetually. Now again, I think there are a few things that we can take from this more explicit example to help us in our everyday Bible study. First of all, something as subtle as a name can be a message that points forward to Christ. What does he say about this man's name? Well, you have Melchizedek, which means king of righteousness. Does that sound familiar? And then incidentally, king of Salem, what does that mean? King of peace. And so again, something as subtle as a name of a man himself and a city, you have met in the priest most high in Jesus, truly the king of righteousness and king of peace. You go beyond that, but genealogies are important, even when they're not there. Now, I will just say, I think genealogies, that is an easy part when we get to that portion, and I think it's the first 9 chapters of 1 Chronicles in our daily Bible reading when we get there. That gets a little difficult to go through. Maybe, I don't know, maybe that's more difficult for people than Leviticus. Maybe. Because you're just reading a lot of names. I do think there's value in reading those names. Listen, it can be difficult. I'm not saying it's not, but I do think there's value. There's value just in noting the kingship of Christ. As you look at the genealogy in Matthew and over in Luke as well, you find that he truly is a descendant of David, that he is a rightful descendant of the throne by earthly standards and by heavenly standards. In Luke, he goes all the way back to Adam, who was the Son of God. And so even in the genealogies, those are important. All of these things can be indicators that just bolster our strength in the Scriptures, our encouragement by the Scriptures, bolster our faith in understanding these things. And so all of these things, no matter how maybe trivial they may seem, especially when you see them used by New Testament writers, this gives us keys to keep in mind as we're going through our daily Bible reading. Now, one more example, and I promise that's the last one. One more example. Numbers chapter 20. We already mentioned this, so we don't have to go back there, but you understand that Moses fails. And he is therefore barred from the promised land. He can't go in because he has disobeyed God because of unbelief, and so he's not allowed to take the people into the promised land after 40 years. Now, Joshua has to take them the rest of the way, where Moses was not able. Do you know the Greek translation of the name Joshua? It's Jesus. When you look at Jesus, it's the same name as Joshua. So you have Jesus the Christ. It's Joshua. And so when you go back to Deuteronomy and when you get into Joshua, what you find is that where Moses, the law, could not provide, Joshua, Jesus, gets them the rest of the way. I don't know about you, but the first time I heard that, my jaw dropped. I thought that was amazing. Because it is amazing. The foreshadowing of God will never cease to amaze me. It's so much better than earthly authors. That he can so long ago, even in these little details, show you what he's planning on doing. Moses was never going to be the one that got them to the promise. Remember in Hebrews chapters 3 and 4 that we read earlier, what are we waiting for? But a promised land? And Moses isn't going to get us there. He leads us to the one that will, but he's not going to be able to be the one to get us there. Only Jesus is the one that can. And so, remember the warning that the Hebrew writer gives in chapters 3 and 4. Make sure that you do not suffer from that same unbelief. Make sure that you do not follow the same pattern as that generation who did not trust in God and therefore was not able to enter that rest. Are you going to follow Jesus, or are you going to reject the way that generation did? Are you willing to do everything that he has required of you? Well, listen, I know we've been talking a lot about the Old Testament, a lot about the law. Don't forget, and I hope I make this clear as we go throughout the week, the reason it's so important is because it's all about Jesus. And so the question is, do you have Jesus tonight? Do you have the salvation that only he can give, that no one and nothing else can give? If you're willing to pledge yourself to the King, if you're willing to get rid of everything that he says to get rid of, willing to confess that he is the Lord, the Son of the living God, be baptized into his death for newness of life in his life, you can have that this very evening. If you're subject to the invitation, let your need be made known as we stand and as we sing.